Great. Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
How's that? Good. Great. Okay. Welcome, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to have Benjamin Balint here at the Morgan today to discuss Kafka's manuscripts. Balint is the author of numerous books, most recently Bruno Schulz, An Artist, a Murder, and the Hijacking of History, Running Commentary, and Jerusalem, City of the Book, co-written with Merav Mack. Today, however, he is going to focus on the subject of his last book, Kafka's Last Trial, which was internationally acclaimed and won the 2020 Sami Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. In it, Balint deftly and indefatigably traces not only the legal trials over the papers that Kafka's best friend and literary executor Max Brod brought to Tel Aviv in 1939, but also the full context of those writings as literature, as physical items, and what those materials have meant to individuals, communities, and nations over the course of the past 100 or so years. And with that, I'll turn things over to Benjamin.
Hey, can everyone see me? I don't see myself. No. Just give me a moment. I'll figure out. Yes. Hello, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, self-identified heirs of Kafka's legacy, fans of the Morgan Library, and just those of you who, like Joseph K., are here without quite knowing why. Welcome to all of you. We're meeting today not in a courtroom, but it may as well be one because the subject before us is a case, a trial that I'd like to share with you. The subject is a trial that's really outlived the defendant by a full century, a trial in which no judgment is ever really final, no plaintiff is ever satisfied. And we, all of us today, by virtue of our own interest and fascination as readers of Kafka, are called as witnesses. So let's put Kafka on trial for a moment. The question before us is one that has haunted his afterlife this last century. And that question is, who owns Kafka? Where does Kafka belong? This question, I want to suggest, is not just an abstraction. It's played out in courts and not just in metaphorical courts. I'd like to tell you about a court case that I attended in the summer of 2016 in the Supreme Court of Israel, where the justices listened to 3 teams of lawyers argue over manuscripts that Kafka had entrusted or had given in some way to Max Brod, who then entrusted them to his secretary and lover, Esther Hoffe, who then bequeathed them to her daughter in Tel Aviv, Eva Hoffe, who was storing them in a Tel Aviv apartment on Spinoza Street that she shared along with dozens of her cats, as if the manuscripts of Kafka had decided to rest in a kind of bureaucratic limbo under feline supervision. Kafka himself, who was the writer of parables, left us a final parable with no punchline. And that was, of course, his instruction to Max Brod, an instruction designed to self-destruct. Dearest Max, my last request, everything I leave behind me, all the manuscripts, to be burned unread. And what did Max Brod, Kafka's closest friend, literary executor, do? Well, of course, he did exactly the opposite of the instructions. He published everything, he preserved everything, he edited, he redacted, sometimes quite with a heavy hand. We might say that today, by necessity, we read Kafka broadly. When Kafka died in 1924, Max Brod dedicated the next years to publishing and promoting both the 3 unfinished novels of Kafka, but also the figure of Kafka. In some ways, I think Kafka was the greatest character Max Brod ever conceived. And he was, of course, also the first biographer of Kafka in 1937. And 2 years after that biography, in March of 1939, Max Brod, together with his wife Elsa, had to flee Prague on the very day of the Nazi invasion. And they were able to, in great haste, take out the last train that was allowed to leave. And Max Brod took with him not his own archive and not his own possessions, but a suitcase stuffed with the priceless manuscripts of Franz Kafka. In a way, we can think of Max Brod as rescuing Kafka in the very act of betrayal. He was rescuing him first, literally, from himself. He rescued these manuscripts then from obscurity by publishing them, and he rescued them from the Nazi onslaught, an onslaught that, not coincidentally, would in which all three of Kafka's sisters would perish in the Second World War. I would like to show you, this is simply an illustration of the many Kafkas we'll be talking about today, because there are as many Kafkas as he has interpreters. But this is a photograph that was really only recently found, and that's Max Brod in the center on the day of his arrival at the Tel Aviv port in March of 1939. Unfortunately, the suitcase is out of view, out of frame. But this was the very day that the manuscripts of Franz Kafka had arrived in the Tel Aviv port. You know, that Max Brod, this was not his first choice. He was desperate to get out of the country for months. He was turned down by every other country to which he applied. Sometimes he would dangle almost as a prize, the manuscripts of Kafka, to get him, for example, an invitation to the States or an invitation to Princeton, where Thomas Mann was between 1938 and 1941. All of these attempts failed. So he ends up in Tel Aviv, where his day job was to serve as the dramaturg of the Habima Theater, the National Theater in Israel. That's Max Brod on the right with some actors. He reads plays. He also rejects many plays. So I've seen, if you wanted your play to be produced, you would submit to Max Brod, and he would be the guy from whom you would get a letter of rejection most of the time. And I've seen the little notes that he collected, that he wrote on all of the submissions. And he was really instrumental in broadening the National Theater and the horizons of what theater could do in that country. At the same time, he is dedicated to editing and publishing as much as possible the manuscripts that he had brought with him. And to do so, because it's such an immense task, he enlisted the services of his secretary, who also became his lover, and that's her on the left, sitting with him in the 1960s in Max Brod's apartment, poring over some of these manuscripts. And her name was Esther Ilse Hoffe, herself a former resident of Prague who had to flee. And he was not able to pay. Max Brod himself took no compensation for any of his work on editing the works of Franz Kafka, and he was therefore also not able to pay or compensate Esther Hoffe. So when he was composing his will in the 60s, he demonstrated essentially that he was a much better novelist than he was a writer of wills, because his will included a great deal of ambiguity. He says, on the one hand, "Dear Esther, I am bequeathing to you all of Kafka's manuscripts to do with as you wish." But in another clause of the same will, he says, "But I also wish that you, Esther, before you pass away, that you would arrange for the proper deposit of this priceless treasure in a public library, such as the National Library of Israel or the Tel Aviv Municipal Library or another library here or abroad." And that brings us to the trial, because Esther Hoffe, when Max Brod passed away in 1968, she did something that she never dared to do during his lifetime. She started to sell things. The most famous example is she went to Sotheby's in 1988 and sold the original manuscript of Kafka's unfinished masterpiece, The Trial. It sold for about $2 million, the highest ever paid at that point for a modern literary manuscript. And the buyer was the Marbach Literature Archive in Germany, one of the greatest archives in the world, and certainly the greatest archive for German language literature. But she also sold other things, and she was helped in this endeavor by her daughter. That's Max Brod, also in Tel Aviv. That's Max Brod and Esther Hoffe. Max Brod was really a father figure to Esther's two daughters, Eva and Ruti. That's Eva, who I came to know in Tel Aviv. That's her as a young woman. And that's Eva on the left, sitting with Max Brod in the center, and her father, Otto Hoffe, on the right side of the screen. And the Esther Hoffe decided to, she had the help of her daughter Eva, they're sitting on the left, happened to be a lifelong employee of El Al, the Israel National Airlines, and she could fly wherever she wanted. And it was alleged already since the 1970s that the two women, mother and daughter, who were living together, were smuggling out various Kafka materials. We telescope now to Esther Hoffe, who in 2007 died at the ripe old age of 102. And Eva and her sister show up in the Tel Aviv family court for a routine probate of the mother's will. The mother given all of Max Brod's estate, including these Kafka papers, to her daughters. And at that point, the state of Israel steps in and yells, "Stop. These are national cultural treasures." And this trial lasted 9 years as it wound its way up from the family court. And I think it's symbolic in a way that this started off in the family court as if it were a custody case, and Kafka was the child, or at least his legacy was the child, and finally culminated in 2016. And it was really a three-part case. You had on the one hand Israel, which claimed Kafka as a Jewish writer. Germany, represented by the Marbach archive, which claimed him as a German writer by dint of his language. And you had the Hoffe family, for whom these manuscripts were a precious thread that tied the Hoffe family to Max Brod, that tied Max Brod to his former glory days in Prague, and that also, as an umbilical cord, almost tied Max Brod back to Kafka himself, his closest friend. So in a way, you can look at these physical manuscripts, many of which are here in this very building at the Morgan Library, as a connective thread, right, which connects Kafka to Brod's exile, and finally to this three-way court case in the Supreme Court in 2016. And then you have, as another sort of implicit or let's say, unstated party to the case, were the shifting coalition of readers who wanted to claim Kafka as the great writer of alienation, the writer who saw courts as themselves incomprehensible and verdicts as inevitable, now found himself at the center of a battle over his cultural citizenship, over his cultural custodianship. That was one of the great ironies of this case. Let me briefly line out what I heard during the hearings at the Supreme Court, because what I heard astonished me. And the level of sort of ideological language about the how nations instrumentalize writers was just beneath the surface of the legal wrangling during the case. First, the case for Israel, represented by the Israeli lawyers. Kafka inescapably was a Jew. He studied Hebrew very intensively, especially towards the end of his life. Some of those notebooks from his Hebrew. This was Eva Hoffe, as I came to know her around the time of the case, and she's at this photo, 83 years old, standing next to the grave of Max Brod, which she visited and paid pilgrimage to quite frequently. But this is one of Kafka's Hebrew vocabulary notebooks. Another one of the notebooks is here at the Morgan. And what they show is not the typical Hebrew of a beginner, as if you were to yourself, begin to study this language. So, for example, in the top right of the screen, I almost had this idea, and maybe I'll do this one day, is you could write an entire book that looks at the psychology of Franz Kafka through the words that he is choosing to study. So on this one page, for example, you have the word for informer, as in someone who informs on a colleague or a neighbor. You have the word for genius. That's the word in the very top right of the screen, gaon in Hebrew. You have the word for to be anxious. And there is the word finally for tuberculosis. I mean, this is only one page of many pages of the notebooks, but it's a slice of life of what was in the consciousness of Franz Kafka. And it also shows that these are quite advanced words. So on the one hand, Franz Kafka was not a Zionist like Max Brod was. So we have journal entries where he says, Max Brod is always trying to recruit me and bring me into Zionist meetings with with Martin Buber, or and he's always sort of holding that at a great distance. On the other hand, we also have examples where he's fantasizing about moving to Palestine already in the 20s. And so in 1923, he's living with his last lover, Dora Diamant, and they conceive playfully of a fantasy of moving to Tel Aviv, where they would open up a little restaurant, and Dora would be the cook, and Franz Kafka would be the waiter who sees but who is not seen. I once asked Eva Hoffe about this, and her response was, "Ach, Kafka wouldn't have lasted a day here." So he's also imagining his fiancée Felice Bauer together in Palestine. Maybe that's more of a romantic overture than a conviction. But basically, Israel's claim in this trial was predicated on the notion that Jewish cultural production belongs to the Jewish people, that a story that is a quintessentially exilic story, and a writer there's no more quintessentially exilic writer who belongs to the diaspora than Franz Kafka, although he died before there was a state, of course. That he somehow belongs in Jerusalem. That is to say that Jerusalem sees itself as the culmination of a story that began elsewhere. That Jerusalem sees itself not only as a place for the ingathering of refugees and ingathering of exiles, but the ingathering of material culture, the ingathering of cultural production, and the ingathering of Jewish storytelling. And it made this claim, actually, in the Supreme Court. I think this argument would have perplexed Franz Kafka himself, for whom non-belonging was a very important principle. He can be seen as a poet of non-arrival, in a sense. Of course, he famously wrote, what do I have in common with the Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself, and I should stand very quietly in a corner, content that I can breathe. And yet, in one of history's great ironies, or literary history's great ironies, Kafka's posthumous aliyah, or forced aliyah as it might be, was performed against his will, not by divine intervention, but by a Supreme Court ruling in Jerusalem. Let me shift now to the case for Germany presented by the lawyers that were representing Marbach in Jerusalem. Their claim is in some case simpler. Kafka wrote in German, not just any German, but as Hannah Arendt said, the purest German. It was like the stainless steel of German prose. This, of course, is a sort of double-edged compliment. It suggested that on the one hand, Kafka transcended his Czech Jewish origins, that he refined himself into a paragon of the German language, although he was never a German citizen and only briefly ever lived in Germany. After all, Kafka saw himself, and I think others saw him, as very much a minority figure. I mean, he belongs to the Jewish minority, of the German-speaking minority, of the Czech minority within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And yet, the German Literature Archive, already home to the trial manuscript from Sotheby's, sees Kafka as a figure of German literary modernism as such. At the same time, there was something uneasy in this courtroom about Germany's efforts to claim a Jewish writer whose family all perished in the Shoah. That is to say, all three of Kafka's sisters, and this was mentioned during the trial, were killed during the Holocaust. So it left a question, to my mind at least, whether Kafka's presence in Marbach would be an acknowledgement of Jewish cultural contributions to the German language, or would it be an attempt at historical exculpation, which is to say, a kind of atonement, which is to say, was it being used as this precisely, and here's another irony, the man who used who elevated self-condemnation to an art form. And you see that nowhere clearer than in his breakthrough short story, The Judgment, the manuscript of which is in this building. That same writer who elevated self-condemnation to an art form now found himself enlisted in Germany's own attempts to reckon with its very troubled past. So in essence, this trial raised a whole host of cultural conundrums, and the trial really offered an object lesson in how Germany's claim on a writer whose family was decimated in the Holocaust was entangled with that country's post-war attempt to reckon with its own past. And it also raised, on the other hand, Kafka's ambivalence about the prospects of a Jewish state, about, if not about Jewish life or belonging itself, and about Israel's ambivalence towards Kafka. So this also was part of the German claim at the trial that fascinated me, was they would say, oh, you Israelis, you're latecomers to the Kafka business. We've had a critical edition for a long time. We have countless German towns and villages that have a Kafka street. There's not a single Kafka street in the entire country of Israel. There's not a single collected edition of his works in Hebrew translation. You guys are latecomers, right? And they also cited the fact, which was true, that some of this ambivalence towards Kafka, or at least latecoming, was not due to anything particular to Kafka as much as it was due to the ambivalence, especially in the early decades of the state, to the German language as such. The German language was the language of the perpetrators. And this also was part of the cultural conundrum that was raised during the trial. I would wager that I want to make a case for no one. Now that we've made the case for these two countries, perhaps the best answer to the question of ownership is one that Kafka himself would have given. No one owns Kafka, or better yet, Kafka belongs to those who need him most. I have to tell you an anecdote. One time I was in Berlin and I was strolling with a friend in the Steglitz neighborhood in southern Berlin, where he lived with Dora Diamant, his last lover. And I was able to find the house where the two of them lived. It's not marked. And because I'm a practitioner of chutzpah, I knocked on the door, and a young man answered, and I explained I was writing this book. And he very generously and graciously allowed us in. Some of the features, including the stairwell, they're original from the 1920s. It was a very moving experience. But on the way out, I couldn't resist asking this young man. I said, by the way, have you read the fictions of Franz Kafka? And he replied to me, you know, I can't say that I have, but I always try to open the door to those who have read him. And that's, to me, a statement about Kafka, as I said, belonging to those who need him most. When dissidents in Soviet Russia read The Penal Colony and recognized the cold machinery of bureaucratic cruelty, Kafka is theirs. When a reader in New York or Berlin or Tel Aviv feels the walls closing in, Kafka is theirs. When the Palestinian students that I used to teach at Al-Quds University in East Jerusalem read the trial and saw their own labyrinthine legal struggles reflected in Joseph K., Kafka is theirs. In a sense, Kafka anticipated all of this. In one of the blue octavo notebooks, he wrote the following: everything I possess is directed against me, and what is directed against me is no longer in my possession. So his legacy to me is one of resistance to ownership, resistance to any claims of national purity or belonging, resistance to the very notion that literature can be anything but a site of contest, of dissent. Kafka had, as we mentioned, a kind of infinite yearning for non-belonging. He grew up in a Prague, in an empire on the verge of vanishing. He knew that any home offered to him would be a non-home. And like a kind of evasive defendant, he never quite let himself be pinned down into any one of these identities. So I thought we could give Kafka the last word, not a conclusion, because Kafka never gave us conclusions. His works are unfinished, but maybe an image. The image comes from his parable called An Imperial Message, where a dying emperor whispers a message to a messenger. These are his last words, his final instructions. And this messenger begins his journey through an endless series of corridors, through chamber after chamber, past countless layers of obstruction, and he will never reach his destination. And Kafka's message, many of his messages, like Kafka himself, never really arrives. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. So if we can return for a moment to the trial we can understand is a trial over not just physical manuscripts, it's a trial over the hunger of nations to claim writers and artists. Everyone wanted a piece of Kafka, but Kafka, who's also the author of that wonderful phrase that we do have that there is infinite hope, only not for us. That Kafka would not want a piece of anyone. So in the end, we can all think of ourselves as plaintiffs in the case of Kafka. We want him to belong to us, to our anxieties, to our literature, to our cultural and historical wounds. But if his work teaches us anything, perhaps it's that really Kafka belongs nowhere. And in that exquisite non-belonging, he belongs to us all. I just wanted to close, if I could, if we have we have some time, with why it is, and I'll move on to more examples of his Hebrew and some of his drawings, which also turned up at the National Library in Israel. And by the way, there's a fabulous exhibition that is ongoing there at the moment of Kafka's original manuscript. I'll use this as a background to say that one of the reasons that Kafka has been claimed so often in the last century, I think, is that his something to do with his literature itself, which is to say that his fictions are both kind of they both solicit interpretation, they beg for interpretation, and resist interpretation at the same time. Theodor Adorno once remarked that Kafka's fiction was like a parable whose key had been stolen. And Kafka himself never supplied the key. A storyteller, he once said, cannot talk about storytelling. Either he tells stories or is silent. He didn't interpret himself. He gave it to us to be his interpreters. And that's why there are so many there are as many Kafkas as there are those who want to attach a we to Kafka's name. I think that in a case that has not been lacking in ironies, the last maybe irony involves taking a proprietary attitude towards a writer who is so bound up in his refusal to belong, to find a fixed abode. His marginality, as we mentioned, his estrangement was in a certain sense at the very heart of his imagination. The American poet John Ashbery once used the phrase that, if I can borrow his phrase, that Kafka was on the outside looking out. Kafka writes in his diary of his longing for independence, of his longing for the freedom of all things. And I think it's not just that, for example, the places in his fictions go unnamed. It's that he really untethered himself and his writing from all these comforting anchors of national or religious belonging. So does Kafka in the end, does his writing belong to German literature or to the state that regards itself as the representative of Jews worldwide? In the end, is Kafka a German language writer who happened to be Jewish, or a profoundly Jewish writer who honed German into a new Jewish language that was adequate to articulating a Jewish thinking? Or does Kafka's body of work resonate beyond any national canon, obedient to its own laws of motion, to use his own phrase? And as I mentioned, Kafka himself had a premonition of the ways that he would be claimed. And in a letter to his fiancée, Felice Bauer, from 1916, he writes that he's seen two recent articles about his work. One of those articles happened to be by his friend Max Brod. And he writes as follows: Felice, won't you tell me what I really am? In the latest issue of such and such a journal, the writer says, quote, there is something fundamentally German about Kafka's narrative art. In Max's article, on the other hand, he says, quote, Kafka's stories are among the most typically Jewish documents of our time. And I'll add that those documents, that nowhere in his fictions does Kafka use the word Jew. So it's quite something for Max Brod to say that they're among the most typically Jewish documents of our time. A difficult case, Kafka concludes. Am I a circus rider on two horses? Alas, I am no rider, but I lie prostrate on the ground. So, Franz Kafka himself may have long been laid dormant in the ground in the cemetery in Prague. And all of these courtroom commotions may since have calmed, but his writings, whatever their abode, still resonate with us still. And that to me is the most important sort of resonance of his legacy. I have a lot more to say, but I also would love to open it up to conversations and to your comments and to respond as best as I can to your comments. So perhaps I can ask our colleagues from the Morgan to pick out some of your comments and questions from the chat, and we can begin from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Benjamin, for that talk. If anyone has questions that you haven't yet put into the chat, please feel free to do so now. And we will get to as many of them as we can in the next 10 minutes. We have one comment that says, yes, write that book, Psychology of Kafka through Vocabulary and Notebooks.
Thank you for the encouragement. I will say that it's not just Hebrew that became an object of fascination for Kafka, but even before that, the Yiddish language became an object of fascination. It began when he and Max Brod would attend dozens of times performances given by visiting Yiddish theater troupes. This will be a separate lecture, if I move to the last slide, that will be given. These are our upcoming Franz Kafka programs. At the bottom, you'll see a lecture on that will be by an expert in this subject, Nama Sandro, on April the 9th. But I will say that this fascination with the Yiddish language was the occasion for Franz Kafka's only known public talk in his entire life. And that talk was prompted by basically doing a fundraiser for some of the impoverished Yiddish actors. And we have that talk thanks to Max Brod's wife, who was there, scribbling it all down. And in this talk, he subverts his audience's usual sort of expected condescension that German is a language of culture and Yiddish is a mere jargon. And Kafka brilliantly subverts that expectation and shows how Yiddish can bear within it the vitality of especially Eastern European Jewish culture, and it's fantastic. So these Jewish languages, plural, Yiddish and Hebrew, were, I think, the main vectors of Kafka's fascination with Jewish culture. At the same time as he's contrasting his late in life discovery of these languages with the very little that he inherited from his father. So in the famous letter to his father, I believe the manuscript is also not here in the Morgan. Okay, a facsimile is here in the Morgan. He touches very strongly on this point, and he says to the father that the Judaism that you had bequeathed to me was empty of content. It was like a nothing. It was sometimes even worse than a nothing. And he contrasted the emptiness of what he had bequeathed from the kind of bourgeois father to his late in life discoveries of the passions of Yiddish and Hebrew, and that was also part and parcel of the claims that were made in this trial in Jerusalem as to his Jewishness. I will add an anecdote on that point as we're collecting some of your comments. I, for my book, went to Marbach and interviewed the then director. And this was before the verdict in the Supreme Court had been rendered. And I said, Look, I'm all into, the aura of the original manuscripts, and I'm as impressed as anyone by being in the presence of an original manuscript. But what I can't understand is why, in this case, it really matters where geographically the manuscripts of Franz Kafka will be. We know that a great part of those manuscripts are at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Those were given by Max Brod to the surviving niece of Franz Kafka. Others were kept, as I mentioned, in this apartment with the dozens of cats in Tel Aviv. Others were kept the most important ones were kept very carefully in a Swiss bank vault. But I said to the director of Marbach, I said, both you and Marbach and the National Library in Jerusalem have pledged that whoever wins this case, you'll digitize the material and make it available to scholars and readers throughout the world. Why would it matter then? Why would you invest, hundreds of thousands of dollars and your energies in pursuing this legal case? And his answer shocked me. He said, well, in some cases, the geography of an archive is also shapes the interpretation of that archive. And he said, this is such a case. And he said to me, if the Kafka papers end up here if they end up first in Jerusalem, then Kafka will be read narrowly as a Jewish writer. If, however, they end up here in Marbach, the great home of German language literature, which also houses people like Heidegger, then the estate of Kafka will be read in the most universal humanistic sense. As if to say, like, we Germans don't really have interests. Or if we do have interests, they're the interests of literature as such. The Israelis are the ones who really have their grasping interests. And this left me absolutely, flabbergasted, given that we weren't talking about just any country, but precisely Germany, which is now sort of holding itself up under the banner of universal literary culture. And that's another question that we can talk about, perhaps, is to be in a location is to be aware of one's neighbors. The neighbors of Franz Kafka today are at the National Library in Jerusalem, and his neighbors include Martin Buber, his great friend Hugo Bergman, Gershom Scholem, people like this. His neighbors, and those Kafka manuscripts that are today in Marbach, like the Prozess, the trial, though the neighbors are Heidegger and other people that were not necessarily neighborly to Kafka during his lifetime.
Great, thank you. So we have some questions coming into the chat. One of the questions is, were the ironies of the Kafka trial noted and formally documented in the transcriptions in the Kafka trials?
That's a great question. I will say that this trial, as I said, moved its way up, and it was in essence 3 different trials: one at the family court level, one at the appellate level, and one at the Supreme Court level. And what struck me is reading the decisions of each of those 3 levels. Those decisions, judicial decisions, run sometimes to 50, 60 pages. And I read them because I'm not a lawyer myself and I don't have much of a legal background, but I read them as if they were texts of interpretation, as if they were literary texts. And this was my exercise. I said, what happens if we would read these texts, these judicial opinions, as if the judges, and this wasn't an artificial attempt. This came from the language of the decisions themselves, in which the judges were almost regarding themselves as the most recent interpreters of Kafka's legacy. And they had to be, in a certain sense. They were put in a very awkward position of making these pronouncements about literary belonging, not just debating this or that clause of Max Brod's will. And that to me was absolutely fascinating, that each of these, and so, for example, the judges were quoting lines from Kafka's fiction, right, in their own judicial opinions. So while they were not remarking necessarily explicitly on the ironies, they were aware of the literary significance of what they were doing, and they were aware of making decisions that could almost be interpretive literary decisions, something for which they were not, by the way, not well trained or well prepared, but they were forced into that position.
We have a couple of questions about your personal opinion. Do you agree with the outcome of the trial? And do you think Max Brod did the right thing?
I think that first, Kafka knew exactly what he was doing when he asked Max Brod, of all people, to destroy these manuscripts. I think he wanted to have it both ways. He wanted to issue this instruction, but he knew that he was issuing the instruction to the person least capable of fulfilling it. I think that Max Brod was, in some sense, he did betray, unquestionably, Kafka and Kafka's last wish, but the betrayal was also an act of love, an act of devotion, as some betrayals may be. I think that he made certain decisions that he could have gone other ways. For example, if I were Max Brod, I could have said the literary material belongs to literary history. It's larger than myself, and that I will bring out to the world. But the personal material, that is to say, Max Brod was also collecting all the love letters that Kafka, in which Kafka poured out his soul. He was the one who made the decision to publish the letters to Felice, the letters to Kafka's lover, Czech lover, and translator Milena Jesenska, to publish the very intimate letter to the father, which was, by the way, never delivered. Another message of Kafka's that was never delivered. So those decisions really could have been otherwise, and it was his decision also to publish the diaries and journals of Kafka. Yes, it was a betrayal, but a betrayal that I think was motivated by devotion and love. And you know, I have certain sympathies with. I think that in each of the triangle of interest that animated this case, there were grounds of legitimacy, and in each case, the sides exceeded those grounds. So I think there was legitimacy. For example, that when Israel makes the claim that it's not a coincidence that these manuscripts are here, because if there were no Palestine at that point and no burgeoning Zionist movement, then these papers would have met the same fate as Kafka's sisters, and Max Brod himself would have met that same fate. And this is a place that offered him refuge. Therefore, it's no coincidence that they ended up in Tel Aviv. But I also think that the National Library exceeded its legitimacy in the ways that it prosecuted this case as an all or nothing case. And in the end, when it won the case, it was not required to give any compensation whatsoever to Eva Hoffe. I had a lot of sympathy for Eva Hoffe. I met her many, many times. She was an extraordinarily intelligent person who did not ask to inherit this trial. Her inheritance ended up being a legacy of disinheritance, and she died quite tragically 2 years after she lost this trial, absolutely shattered and devastated, because this was, as I said, this was a material legacy that bound her intimately to her late mother and to her father figure, Max Brod, and to her own past. So yeah, that's my opinion. I discussed this once with an Israeli poet who told me, from my perspective, they should send these manuscripts to the moon. And I thought that was very interesting because that's basically the fantasy that there could be some extraterritorial literary space in which nations do not make claims. And on this earth, we don't have such spaces. We have to make such decisions. Yeah. Maybe we can one day found a international archive on the moon.
We have a question here asking if you could recommend any particular English translations of Kafka as most faithful to him.
Yes, there's a translation that came out less than a year ago by Mark Harman of the Collected Stories, which I think is fabulous. There's a new translation by Ross Benjamin for Schocken Press, for Schocken Books of the diaries, which undoes some of the damage that Max Brod did to those diaries. So I can highly recommend both those, the Mark Harman and the Ross Benjamin.
And there was a question also about the Kafka bio that came out years ago, the 3-volume Kafka bio.
Yeah, that was a brilliant biography by the German Rainer Stach. And yeah, I think it's an absolutely brilliant labor of love. And I can highly recommend that biography. Uh, I will say that that biography itself has intersects the trial that we were speaking about today in an interesting way, which is that among the less legitimate actions of the Hoffa family was that they restricted scholars from even having a look at copies, let alone the originals of the materials in their possession. And this kind of thwarted legitimate research for quite some time. So Stach actually, in the hopes that some of this material would surface, wrote the first volume, chronologically the first, last, because he was hoping for some, like many other scholars and biographers and interpreters, hoping against hope that this material would surface.
Just a couple more questions coming in. I think we have time maybe for one more. Can you share a few thoughts about the interconnections between Kafka and Bruno Schulz, who also was the subject of a posthumous custody battle in Israel, as you recount in your great book?
Thank you for that question. Bruno Schulz is sometimes called the Polish Kafka. He was born a few years after Franz Kafka. He was also, like Kafka, kind of a member of a minority community within the larger Austro-Hungarian Empire. I will say, by the way, that I once gave a talk about Kafka in Vienna, and during the Q&A, an audience member got up and declared, "I don't see the point of all of this. Everyone knows that Kafka was an Austrian." So in that sense, also Bruno Schulz was born a member of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and has certain biographical parallels to Kafka. And yeah, and what I was interested in was also the posthumous claims made on Bruno Schulz, who was a master of the Polish language to such a degree that Olga Tokarczuk, the Nobel Prize-winning Polish author, told me that it's almost as if she has the sense, almost as if Bruno Schulz's mastery of Polish was such that he had invented the language. But he's in this very provincial town in Polish Galicia called Drohobycz, and he was, before he was murdered by an SS officer in 1942, he was commanded to paint murals. And the murals were for the children's room of the SS officer who had essentially enslaved Bruno Schulz. And not long after Bruno Schulz was shot down in the streets of Drohobycz, not 100 yards from where he was born. And then after the Second World War, when this town becomes part of Ukraine, the murals were painted over. The SS villa was apportioned and divided into smaller apartments, and the murals were considered lost. 60 years later, they were rediscovered almost miraculously, only to disappear once again, because 3 months after the rediscovery of the murals in the kitchen, what was then the kitchen pantry of an elderly Ukrainian couple, a 3-person team from Israel, including at least one member I've confirmed who is an agent of the Mossad, went to Drohobycz and through a combination of bribery and spycraft got permission to chisel out 5 fragments of Bruno Schulz's last artworks down to the plaster and smuggle them out of the country back to Yad Vashem. And here too, it's very interesting what assumptions are being made. It's very clear that many international laws of cultural preservation were violated in that act, and yet Yad Vashem asserted a moral right to Bruno Schulz as a victim of the Shoah who was not remembered, whose memory essentially was uncommemorated in Drohobych itself and in Western Ukraine, and was completely uncelebrated, who was only very late even translated into Ukrainian. So many people in his own hometown never read Bruno Schulz. And I talked to the Holocaust historian Yehuda Bauer, who tragically died at the age of 98 just last October. And he also asserted the fact that Drohobych is not a site of memory, yet that these murals, he said, he made the point essentially that artworks, like manuscripts, their accent can change depending on where they are. And he said that those murals would speak much more eloquently in Yad Vashem, which attracts about 2 million visitors a year, than they would be in provincial Drohobych, where nobody cared about Bruno Schulz. So in that sense, yes, there is a parallel to the posthumous cultural claims that were made on a writer, because on the one hand, Bruno Schulz, his relation to Polish language was similar to Kafka's relation to German. He's considered to be a Polish modernist of the first rank. And yet he was also killed because he was a Jew. And so here's another diaspora story that was seen by an Israeli cultural institution, in this case, an institution of memory, as having its proper culmination in Jerusalem rather than abroad. So yes, it's another fascinating case of these contradictory cultural claims.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Benjamin, for this fascinating investigation of Kafka. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this talk today. I hope some of you will be able to come visit us in person and see the exhibition. Please check our website for other programs coming up. Some of them Benjamin mentioned already. And we look forward to seeing you at programs in the future. Thank you again, Benjamin.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.